Jake and Sarah stood in the dense fog, their breath visible in the cold, damp air. The echo of the bus's rumble faded into the distance, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Everything around them was shrouded in an impenetrable gray mist. No street signs, no buildings, just an endless, desolate void. Sarah gripped Jake's arm tightly. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Jake scanned the fog, his mind racing. There was no path forward, no sense of direction. All they knew was that they had stepped off the bus, and now they were somewhere, or somewhere else, entirely. "We're not in the real world anymore," Jake said, his voice hollow. "This is a place in between, like a limbo." The distant rumble of the bus engine sounded again, only this time it felt closer, more deliberate. It wasn't gone, it was hunting them. They began to walk, unsure of where they were going, but driven by an instinct to keep moving. The fog swirled around them, shifting and distorting like it was alive, closing in tighter the longer they walked. The cold air grew colder, biting at their skin. Suddenly, Sarah stopped, gripping Jake's arm even tighter. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jake listened. There, hidden within the eerie quiet, was a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps. It was slow, deliberate, and it wasn't far away. "Who's there?" Jake called into the fog, his voice echoing unnaturally in the void. But there was no response. The footsteps grew louder. Slowly a shape emerged from the mist, a figure moving toward them. As it came closer, they could see it was a person, but something was horribly wrong. The figure's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its limbs twisted, and its eyes hollow like the passengers on the bus. "It's one of them," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "The passengers." The figure moved toward them with jerky, uneven steps, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Jake grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her away. "We need to go, now." They broke into a run, racing through the fog, but more shadows began to appear, figures emerging from the mist, surrounding them. Each one had the same lifeless, hollow eyes, their bodies distorted and broken, as if they had suffered some terrible accident. Jake realized these were the souls of those who had once been trapped on the bus, now wandering this limbo. "We can't outrun them," Sarah cried, panic rising in her voice. "They're everywhere." Jake's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The bus was the key. It always had been. The driver had said they needed to choose, but Jake didn't understand the full meaning of that choice. They had stepped off the bus, thinking it would save them, but now they were trapped in this in-between world. Then it hit him. Maybe the bus wasn't just a prison. Maybe it was the only way out. "We need to find the bus," Jake said suddenly, pulling Sarah in the opposite direction. "It's the only way." The fog seemed to thicken as they ran, but in the distance Jake could hear it again, the low rumble of the bus engine, growing louder. He followed the sound, weaving through the endless mist, dodging the shadowy figures that reached out toward them. Finally, the headlights pierced through the fog, and the bus emerged, gliding toward them like a predator stalking its prey. The doors hissed open as it stopped in front of them, the driver staring down with those same hollow eyes. "Back again?" the driver said in his cold, emotionless voice. "Are you ready to make your choice this time?" Jake hesitated. "What choice? What do you mean?" The driver's lips twisted into a grim smile. "You think you can just walk away from the bus? There are only two ways this ends. You ride to the end of the line, or you become one of them." He motioned to the figures in the fog, the souls of the lost passengers. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Sarah, who was pale with fear. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "We have to get out." The driver's gaze locked onto Jake. "You can return to your world," he said, "but only if you accept the journey. This bus doesn't just take passengers, it carries their souls to the place they belong. Face your fear, ride with me, and perhaps you'll survive." Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing. The driver's words echoed in his head, "Accept the journey." Was that what Arthur had meant all along? That he had survived because he didn't try to escape, but accepted his fate? Jake knew what he had to do. He turned to Sarah. "We have to get on the bus." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? No, we barely got away the last time." "I think that's the only way out," Jake said, his voice resolute. "We have to face it. If we try to run, we'll end up like them." He motioned toward the shadowy figures, who now hovered at the edge of the fog, watching them with their hollow eyes. Reluctantly, Sarah nodded. Together they stepped onto the bus. The doors closed behind them with a final ominous hiss. The bus jolted forward, and the passengers, the same lifeless figures as before, turned their heads slowly, staring at Jake and Sarah with empty eyes. But this time, Jake didn't panic. He sat down, holding Sarah's hand, and faced the road ahead. The bus sped through the fog, the world outside warping and twisting as they traveled deeper into the unknown. Jake's heart raced, but he held on to one thought: we will survive this. The road ahead grew darker, and Jake felt the weight of the journey bearing down on him. The whispers returned, swirling around them, but this time Jake didn't let the fear consume him. As they neared what felt like the end of the line, the driver spoke again, his voice low and eerie. "You've made your choice. Now you must see it through." The bus came to a stop in front of a crumbling, ancient gate. Beyond it, darkness stretched endlessly. Jake and Sarah stood up, hesitating as the doors opened. "This is your stop," the driver said, his eyes glinting with something almost human. Jake took a deep breath and stepped off the bus with Sarah at his side. The gate creaked open, revealing a path through the void. They exchanged a look, unsure of what lay ahead, but knowing they had no other choice. The bus rumbled behind them, and when they turned, it was gone, vanished into the mist. Jake and Sarah walked through the gate, stepping into the unknown. The world around them began to shift, colors bleeding into the gray void. Slowly the fog lifted, and they found themselves back on the street, where it all began. But something was different. The street was empty, and the air felt still. They were back in the real world, or so it seemed. But as they looked around, Jake noticed subtle changes. The sky was a little too dark, the buildings a little too distant. "We made it," Sarah said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "We're home." Jake wasn't so sure. He turned toward the horizon, and in the distance, just beyond the edge of town, he thought he saw it, the faint outline of a bus, waiting in the shadows, and he knew this journey was far from over. Days passed since Jake and Sarah's return to what seemed like the real world, but something was deeply wrong. Even though they were back in their familiar surroundings, the world felt off. Time seemed to stretch and contract. The air felt heavier, the shadows longer, and always, just at the edge of their vision, was the vague silhouette of a bus waiting in the distance. Jake had tried to go back to work, to resume his life, but everywhere he went, he felt it, the presence of the bus. Sarah felt it, too. No matter how far they ran, how much they tried to distract themselves, the bus was there, lurking just beyond their reach. They weren't truly free. It was late one night when the whispers returned. Jake woke up in a cold sweat, hearing the same low murmurs that had filled the bus during their journey. He shot up in bed, heart pounding, his eyes darting around the room. The whispers were faint, barely discernible, but he recognized them instantly. His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of it. Was it all happening again? Had they never really escaped? Jake stumbled out of bed, grabbing his phone to check the time. 3 a.m. in the dead of night. The whispers grew louder, filling the room like a sinister chorus. He rushed to the window and froze. There, just outside his apartment, was the bus. The same rusted, broken-down bus, sitting idly on the street with its headlights dimly glowing, waiting for him. The driver's face was barely visible through the glass, but Jake could feel his eyes on him, cold and unblinking. No, Jake whispered, not again. Jake fumbled for his phone, dialing Sarah's number. It rang several times before she finally picked up, her voice groggy and afraid. Jake, what's going on? It's back, Sarah. The bus. It's outside my apartment. There was silence on the other end. He could hear her breathing, the fear seeping into her voice. I saw it too, outside my place. It's like it never left. Jake clenched his fists. We need to figure out what's going on. This thing, it's not over. Sarah's voice cracked. What do we do? Jake thought back to everything they had been through. The driver's cryptic words, the cursed passengers, the choice they had made to ride the bus. He had hoped that accepting the journey was enough, but now he realized they had only delayed the inevitable. We need to confront it, Jake said finally. We need to find out what it wants. They met later that night, under the glow of the streetlights. The bus sat in the distance, waiting for them like a predator ready to pounce. Jake and Sarah stood side by side, their faces pale but determined. We get on, Jake said, his voice steady. But this time, we don't just ride. We ask the driver what's really going on. There has to be more to this than just a cursed bus. Sarah swallowed hard, nodding. Okay, let's do it. The bus doors creaked open as they approached, the same hiss of air escaping as if the bus itself was exhaling. The passengers were there, as always, still, lifeless, their hollow eyes watching Jake and Sarah as they took their seats. The driver glanced at them through the rearview mirror, his face as cold and expressionless as ever. But this time, Jake wasn't afraid. We're done running, Jake said firmly. Tell us what's really going on. Why does this keep happening? The driver didn't answer at first. The bus jolted forward, its wheels grinding against the road, and the familiar darkness swallowed the world outside. Finally, the driver spoke, his voice low and hollow. You can't outrun fate. Jake's hands clenched into fists. What fate? What does the bus want from us? The driver's lips curled into a thin, eerie smile. The bus doesn't want anything. It's the journey you chose. Every rider must face their destination, and you're almost there. As the bus rumbled through the fog-shrouded streets, Jake noticed something he hadn't seen before. The passengers, once silent and unmoving, were beginning to shift. Their hollow eyes turned toward him and Sarah, and faint whispers began to fill the air. One of the passengers, a woman with long, tangled hair, leaned toward Jake, her voice rasping as she spoke. We all made the same choice once. We thought we could escape. But the bus, it never lets you go. Sarah stared at the woman, her face paling. Who are you? We are the forgotten, the woman whispered. Those who tried to leave, those who thought they could cheat the journey. But the bus always finds you. It always brings you back. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. So there's no way out? The woman's eyes were hollow, filled with an endless despair. You don't escape the bus. You accept the ride, and eventually, you reach the end. The bus rolled to a stop. The fog outside had thickened, and through the swirling mist, Jake could see it. A massive, looming structure in the distance. A station. old and decrepit, with a single flickering light marking its entrance. The sign above the door read, "End of the line." The doors creaked open, and the passengers slowly began to rise from their seats, their movements stiff and unnatural. One by one, they shuffled off the bus and disappeared into the fog. Jake and Sarah remained frozen in their seats, fear gripping them as the driver turned to face them. His eyes, once cold and distant, now glowed with an unnatural light. "This is your final stop," the driver said softly. "The choice you made brought you here. Now you must face what lies beyond." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "What's beyond?" The driver smiled, a haunting, knowing smile. "The truth." Jake stood, his legs trembling as he stepped off the bus with Sarah by his side. The fog swallowed them whole as they approached the station, its dark, towering entrance looming ahead. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers around them grew louder, more insistent. Jake could feel the weight of every choice they had made, every step that had led them to this moment. They reached the station's door, its rusted handle cold beneath Jake's hand. He glanced at Sarah, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. Inside the station was a vast, empty space, filled with nothing but darkness. And in the center of that darkness stood a single figure, an old man, hunched and weary, his eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. "You've come at last," the man said, his voice ancient and filled with sorrow. Jake and Sarah stepped forward, confusion and fear mingling in their minds. "Who are you?" Jake asked. The old man smiled faintly. "I am the one who began the journey, the first rider of the bus." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. "You started all this?" The old man nodded slowly. "Long ago I made a choice to face my fears, to confront my destiny. But in doing so, I created something far worse, a journey that never ends, a bus that never stops. And now, every rider must face the same choice." Jake's mind reeled. "So how do we stop it?" The old man's gaze softened. "You don't stop it, you accept it. You ride the bus and you reach the end. Only then will you find peace." Jake and Sarah exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy with the weight of the truth. There was no escape, no running from the bus or the journey it represented. They had to face it, together. As they turned back toward the bus, the fog began to lift, revealing the path ahead. The end of the line was near, and their final journey had just begun. Epilogue. Jake and Sarah had faced the truth of the bus, but their journey was far from over. They knew now that there was no escaping the cursed ride, no avoiding the choices that had brought them here. But with every mile they traveled, they grew stronger, more resolute, determined to see the journey through to its end, whatever that might be. And so, the bus continued its endless journey, carrying its passengers through the fog, through the darkness, toward the unknown. Because on the last bus, the ride never truly